This Choircast podcast is brought to you by The Collective. At The Collective, we believe that justice isn't optional, it's actually sacred. That's why we're building a growing library of progressive resources, connecting you with queer and Black-owned businesses, linking to books that challenge the status quo, and delivering content that empowers you to resist fascism with clarity and compassion. So join the movement. Support the mission. Visit The Collective, that's QUOLLECTIVE.com, The Collective, to learn more and get involved.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? Damn. We're back and it's episode 100. I can't believe we have done 100 of these episodes, and this one I think you are going to absolutely love. We are diving into more Christmas lore this time, and I kind of want to bring it to you. Jesus might have been born in a cave, and maybe I wasn't born in Bethlehem either. Right? We have this idea of the nativity, the nativity scene that we have in our homes. We imagine Bethlehem, a stable, soft animals, like a baby glowing at the centers, and angels flying overhead. But when you look at the biblical text and at church history, there's no wooden barn in the biblical text. There's absolutely no description of animals gathered peacefully. And the earliest Christians, when they were trying to figure out where that happened and like venerate a location, they remembered a cave. And then when we talk about Jesus is called Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Bethlehem. So why does the Christmas story insist on Bethlehem? That's really where the tension begins, where we're going to start into this. Bethlehem versus Nazareth, the two competing birthplaces of Jesus. Let's just dive right into the Bible. Matthew opens his birth story with confidence, zero hesitation. He says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, right? Right at the beginning, Bethlehem. Luke has a different setup. Joseph and Mary start in Nazareth, then travel south because of a Roman census to Bethlehem. So Jesus in that story is from Nazareth, but born in Bethlehem. And this tension sits right inside the Bible. And when you look at Jesus later, throughout the Jesus story, he is Jesus of Nazareth, right? Which implies he was born in Nazareth. So why does Bethlehem have to be here? What are there reasons to have Jesus born in Bethlehem? What is the meaning that happens there? So Bethlehem carries with it enormous messianic symbolism as the city of David. There's a scholar, Raymond Brown. He points out that both infancy narratives independently converge on Bethlehem. They have a different story of how it happens, right? But that's where the birth happens, in those infancy narratives. And so the more conservative people will say the canon agrees on this, and that that carries theological weight. But scholars like Bart Ehrman point out that all four Gospels consistently agree that Jesus was from Nazareth. And that argument that the more conservative people make, that the canon agrees that that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, they're sort of unifying those two. The problem is those two stories, when you fit them together, they don't really work well together, right? So Luke anchors Jesus' birth to a very specific historical marker. Luke 2:2. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. But in the book of Matthew, Jesus is born during the reign of Herod. But that's a problem because Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until 6 CE, and Herod the Great died in 4 BCE. So that creates like minimum 10-year gap between Luke's census and Matthew's connection of the birth to the reign of Herod. Like, this is not a minor discrepancy. It's like one of the hardest historical conflicts in the entire nativity story. But this connection of Luke to Quirinius has another way more complicated problem, in that it says Quirinius orders a census, but the census requires everybody to return to their ancestral town for registration, and that's why they've got to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem. But that's not how Roman taxation worked. Right? Like, there is no evidence that people were required to return to their hometowns for census. And of course, because like that doesn't work. You don't tax people in a place where they don't live. You tax people where they live. Like, Rome would not have worked if taxation happened this way. And on top of that, there is no historical record of a census happening like this in this place in this time. Okay, so if there's problems with its accuracy, why is it in there? Why does Bethlehem figure so prominently in the text? Like, what are the writers doing by making sure that Jesus is born in Bethlehem? Well, that is the really interesting part. So they're not trying to give some historical birth certificate. They're trying to tell you who Jesus was and the importance of him. So I mentioned before, Bethlehem is tied to messianic prophecy, right? Before Jesus come, Bethlehem already carries this messianic weight. It's the city of David, right? Israel's ideal king. And then over the years, there's a passage from the prophet Micah that begins to sort of be rooted in this promise of a Messiah that will come and will, be like Moses and upend everything. And it's Micah 5:2. It says, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origins is from old, from ancient days." And Matthew, by putting Jesus in Bethlehem, can quote this prophecy and say, look, this is fulfilled, right? He does that in Matthew chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. It says, they told him in Bethlehem in Judea, right? This is when they're trying to the wise men come and they're trying to figure out where the Bible says the Messiah is going to be born, right? They told him in Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means among the least of the rulers of Judah, for you shall from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. This is a sort of summary of this Micah verse. And so by locating Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, the writers are very beautifully, in this very nuanced way, saying this child belongs to the Davidic promise, right? This isn't just some other teacher. This isn't a random person that is gonna try to claim that they're the Messiah. Bethlehem works as this sort of theological signpost, right? Saying, look, this is an indication of a direction this story is going. But it's also like a storytelling device, right? Luke has this narrative tension to solve, right? Because he also wants to make this Bethlehem claim. And Luke recognizes that Jesus is universally known as Jesus of Nazareth. So you have this guy who is known as coming from Nazareth, and you also have this very well-known thing that the Messiah comes from Bethlehem. Luke has to solve that, and so he does that with the census, and but the way Luke positions this is brilliant, because it acts as a sort of narrative hinge. It allows Luke to hold the hometown in Nazareth and the national messianic expectation and this theological identity. It's just beautifully, very artfully done. And then you have this other piece. When Jesus, who's from Nazareth, is born in Bethlehem, you have the story of Herod and the wise men, and Jesus having to flee, right? Him having to become a refugee, fleeing to Egypt, right? The Bethlehem facilitates the fleeing to Egypt, which connects him to this Moses story, and connecting him to the Moses story brings with him the weight of Moses as the Redeemer, as a Messiah figure, right? So what I'm saying with this Bethlehem Nazareth piece is it doesn't have to be either pure history or total fabrication, right? It can be a historical possibility and a prophetic fulfillment symbol and a storytelling device and a theological claim about who Jesus is. We don't have to choose those things. We can hold them all. And if the data that says it didn't actually happen is true, that doesn't change the message, right? The gospel writers are not trying to give you a detailed log of everything that ever happened in Jesus' life. They are trying to tell you who Jesus is. And that is what you have to come to the text asking. And when you come to the text asking that, this says that Jesus is the Messiah. He is coming to fix what is wrong with the world and to upend the power structures that are there and are causing this horrible oppression. So I know I may have burst your bubble about the whole Bethlehem thing. I'm going to do it again. I'm sorry. I think a lot of us imagine the birth of Jesus happening at some ancient version of the dumpster area behind the Hampton Inn because the Hampton Inn was out of rooms, right? That no room in the inn is just a bad translation. So the no room in the inn verse actually is using the word, the word that is translated in less accurate translations as inn is the word kataluma, and kataluma is different than the word for an inn. There was a word for an inn, and Luke uses that word later. He knows that word. Kataluma, though, it doesn't mean a commercial inn at all. There's a really great book by Kenneth Bailey called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, and he's like, really, every village home normally could offer a guest room. And so the other piece is that when you travel from city to city, if you know somebody there, you don't go to an inn that Bethlehem likely didn't have because it wasn't big enough. You go to the people you know. You go to your relatives here in Bethlehem since you're from there. And so this idea of a guest room is interesting, and they come in and they say there's no room in the kataluma, assuming with this whole census narrative that there's a lot of people in town, all the families in town, and so instead they put them where the animals are, and we imagine a stable, right? But instead of a stable, the animals were likely kind of in a cave. So in a bunch of villages, homes were built into like hillside or attached to like a natural cave, like on the lower level of the homes. This cave served as a space where the animals will be brought inside at night, because for peasant homes, animals were the most valuable things that they had, both of monetary value, but of like value for sustaining their family because they produced food or milk, those kinds of things. And so, it's one of the things that that Kenneth Bailey, he says in peasant homes, the animals were brought inside at night into the family living area, which is usually on a lower level. And that living area could be, this lower level could be like built into a cave, right? Because the house might be built on like attached to a cave. And oftentimes the way things were built, the animals would have a shorter, smaller space underneath, where people slept in a slightly higher area. You might think of it kind of as a loft area, and the warmth from the animals would help warm the house. And Craig Keener is where I got that little piece of information. But archaeologists will, when they look at the where mangers were, right? Mangers are normally stone troughs cut into the rock. Into a cave, right? Into these kinds of places. So this idea of this like barn out back definitely doesn't happen. And that's reinforced by something really interesting. Long before our Christmas cards with the manger scene on them and the medieval art, Justin Martyr, who's writing, mid-2nd century, right? 150s, right? That kind of time frame. He says, since Joseph could not find a lodging in that village, he took up his quarters in a certain cave near the village. While they were there, Mary brought forth the Christ and laid him in a manger, right? This is in his dialogue with Trypho. About a century later, another early church father echoes the same idea as this guy named Origen. He says, at Bethlehem, the cave is shown where he was born, and the manger in the cave where he was wrapped in swaddling clothes. So what we have is hundreds of years of venerating a cave as the birthplace of Jesus. And what's really interesting is that at one point, this cave begins to be occupied by another religion and venerated by another religion. And the Christians still come, right? They don't choose another place. They still venerate that spot as the birthplace. There is just an enormous historical weight for it to have happened in a cave. And this goes on all the way to the early 300s, right? So, Constantine legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313, and Christianity shifts almost overnight from a persecuted movement to the imperially favored religion. So, Constantine's mom, Helena, who's already elderly by this point, undertook a state-funded pilgrimage to Judea with two major goals. Number one, identify and preserve the physical locations associated with Jesus, and to convert everybody that had been paganized by the Roman emperors. And she goes and is acting with imperial authority and with all of the resources, monetary and otherwise, of Rome. And so when she shows up in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem is already venerated by the Christians as Jesus' birthplace, she doesn't invent a location, right? She shows up, and they are still venerating this same cave in the mid 300s. And so she doesn't invent a location. She just monumentalizes it, right? She orders the construction of a large basilica over the cave, an altar directly above what was believed to be the birthplace. And this becomes the first Church of the Nativity. That's later rebuilt by Emperor Justinian, and in the 6th century. And the church is still there today. You could go visit. So how do we get from the cave to the Hampton Inn? And for the first several centuries, Christians typically picture Jesus' birth in a cave, right? Not a freestanding barn. And Eastern Christian iconography, pretty much kept that. Mary, the child, the animals inside a dark grotto. But already by the medieval period, you've got some hybrid art, caves morphing into little shed-like roofs, and then over time the cave recedes, while the barn and stable become the norm, right? Because what is happening is the visuals are being made to match the architectural imagination of where that is happening. The next really big shift comes with St. Francis of Assisi. He stages what is widely regarded as the first live nativity scene in Greco Italy, in a rocky setting near a cave. I bet you didn't know that the live nativity that your church may do it goes all the way back to the 1200s, but yeah, it does. So, according to this biography, Thomas of Solano, Francis' goal in this live nativity was not to make some sort of cute Christmas pageant, but to show the hardship of the birth, right? For people to see this with their own eyes. He says to represent the birth of that child in Bethlehem in such a way that with our bodily eyes, we may see what he suffered for the lack of necessities of a newborn babe and how he lay in a manger between ox and donkey, right? This manger scene is a scene of hardship, right? So originally, live nativity is in the incarnation of poverty, real animals, real straw, real discomfort. But over the centuries, that begins to get softened and domesticated, right? Not as much about making people uncomfortable about what he suffers for the lack of necessities. As Christianity spreads into cultures that don't live in caves, like we were talking about with the art, Europeans keep their livestock in timber barns and wooden sheds, not in stone grottos, and so you get this long drift. Byzantine and Eastern icons keep the cave. Western paintings slowly normalize this like wooden stable. And then we get to the Victorian makeover. We go to the 18th and 19th century. Christmas in places like England and early America is like this rowdy street carnival. But if you remember, right, the Victorian era is when like this rise of groups like the Puritans come, and they're not about rowdiness. And eventually they actually banned Christmas celebrations in the 1600s because of that. And then by the 19th century, there are these like middle class reformers that like deliberately try to tame Christmas. They are trying to get Christmas out of the streets and transform it into like a new style of celebration that would take place within the confines of this like tighter family circle and really be focused on the happiness of children. And so in the 19th century, like Christmas begins to like let go of this association with disorder, discomfort, and really change to like a domestic celebration. it has progressed from the very uncomfortable cave imagery of St. Francis's nativity into this rowdy festival, and now it gets pulled from the rowdy festival into the family room, and from the adult chaos into like child-centered, sweet, and the danger is completely gone, right? It's like this domestic nostalgia. And then we have this commercialization of Christmas. Now that it has become safe and tame and all of that, we and child focus, right? We get the ability to sell this, right? And now the imagery really gets soft light, gentle animals, quiet snow, a baby that's never crying, right? Not a dark, cramped cave packed with sweaty bodies and animal smells, right? That's not marketable. So the visuals just keep drifting into things that are very different. And this really wreaks havoc on the deeper meaning, right? Because imagery, like the things that we see, the ways that things are depicted, shape our understanding of it, not just visually, but emotionally, experientially, right? A cave or a crowded lower room keeps us like face to face with the fact that this is like real poverty. There is real risk. There is bodily and animal mess, and a real dependence on like other people's hospitality. When it becomes this like clean, glowing barn, it suggests that God arrives in spaces that are rustic but tidy, right? Picturesque and pastoral. But like the world is harsh, but the holy space is buffered and safe. And the faith should feel like stepping out of the noise into a cozy living room. Pope Francis actually, when he was talking about that nativity that St. Francis of Assisi did, he says that when it's done well, we feel and touch the poverty that God's Son took upon himself. And when we do that, when the full weight of the poverty and the danger is there, the path of humility, poverty, self-denial that leads from the manger to Bethlehem, to the cross, right? It brings us into a very different vision and narrative of who Jesus is and what his story is about. It's very different than the sanitized Hampton Inn version of Christmas, right? The other one invites you to seasonal comfort with a side of shopping. So when you ask, how do we get from the cave to the Hampton Inn? Short answer is history, art, capitalism slowly edits the danger and discomfort out of the story. And once you edit out the danger, you also edit out a lot of what the story was trying to say about where God actually shows up and what we need to be about in the world. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.